Goehring. My name is Shelly Goehring, and I am part of the community assistance team at MHP. And I'm joined here with my colleague Emma. Emma, if you'd like to say hello.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you.
So Emma is also on the community assistance team, and she's going to be helping today to be monitoring the chat and supporting this session. We are doing a training series this December. So on the slide, we have 3 different trainings. Today, we're focusing on affordable housing trust funds and community preservation committees, really looking at the roles of those 2 boards and how they can work together. Next week, we're going to be joined by Amherst and Marshfield's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and they're going to share their process of establishing goals and strategies to create an action plan for their trust. And then on the 18th, we have a guest from the Attorney General's office who's going to dig into what we need to know, what local boards need to know about the Massachusetts open meeting law. Feel free to be putting your questions or comments in the chat, and Emma is going to help monitor those. We're going to try to answer all questions, but we'll also be providing our contact information at the end of the presentation, so you can do some follow-up with us if you need to. And Emma has enabled captions. So if you think that captions would be helpful for you, you can enable those through your Zoom link. I'm going to get started. So again, today we're looking at affordable housing trusts and CPCs. Just very briefly, for those who may not be as familiar with MHP, our full name is Massachusetts Housing Partnership, but we go by MHP, and we're a quasi-state agency that's focused on increasing the supply of affordable housing across the state, as well as increasing people's access to housing that's affordable to them. We have 4 main outward focused teams. Our Center for Housing Data collects, analyzes, and shares data to help inform effective housing policy on the local, regional, and state level. They've created some really fantastic online tools that are available to anyone to really help you with your housing work locally. We have our community assistance team that Emma and I are part of, and we're really focused on helping to support local communities to do effective housing work to address your housing needs. We have a lending team that's lent over $1.4 billion for the creation and preservation of over 27,000 units of affordable rental housing across the state. And then we have a homeownership team that is helping to increase opportunity for low and moderate income households to become homeowners in Massachusetts. So today I'm wanting to start by talking a little bit about the Community Preservation Act and the committee that helps to enforce or support CPA on the local level. And then I'm going to talk some about municipal affordable housing trust funds in Massachusetts. And I know that for some of you, some of this information will feel repetitive or basic, but I don't know where everyone's coming from. So wanting to give a little bit of a baseline. And then I'm going to offer some suggestions for ways that these boards can be working collaboratively in the community, just based on what we've seen in communities across the state. Again, feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat. And Emma will, if there are things that I'm using acronyms on, then Emma will interrupt me so that I can address those right away. But otherwise, I'll pause after each section to take some questions to make sure that that those are being answered in a timely manner. So the Community Preservation Act is a statute in Massachusetts that's unique to our state. It's a really special statute that allows communities to raise additional funds for 4 specific categories of affordable housing, historic preservation, preserving open space, and outdoor recreation. We are up to 200 communities that have accepted the CPA statute in their community, which is exceptional. So well over 50% of our communities in Massachusetts. If you want to read all about it, the act is under Mass General Law, Chapter 44B, and the entity that implements it locally is a public entity. This is a state statute. The board is a public entity. It's created through, or I'm sorry, I should say accepted through ballot referendum. So the CPA Act does have to go in front of all voters in a community, not just town meeting or a city council. The purpose is for these 4 categories to support preserving open space, historic preservation, affordable housing, which is called community housing under CPA, and increasing outdoor recreation opportunities in the local community. It's led by the Community Preservation Committee, which is created once CPA is accepted in the community. There are a minimum of 5 members that are statutory and then up to 9 members. So many communities appoint an additional 4 people to their board. And then because it's a municipal entity, a public entity, it is subject to public procurement, designer selection, conflict of interest, and public meeting laws like all of our other municipal boards. The CPA statute is written so that a community can decide to add up to 3% surcharge of tax levy on real estate. So we have communities that have accepted CPA at a 1% surcharge, at a 1.5%, 2%. It's the community's choice, and it can be up to 3%. The statute also creates the Community Preservation Trust Fund, and this is a state fund that is funded through fees at Registry of Deeds across the state. And then the state distributes these funds on an annual basis to CPA communities. Communities that have accepted CPA at the 3% surcharge get a higher return from the state than communities that have passed it at, for example, 2% or 1.5%. And then really tiny communities are able to receive a higher percentage than the average CPA community. If you want to read about how these funds are distributed, it is outlined in the CPA statute. And then once, then what a community has to work with, the CPA community has to work with are these 2 funding streams. One are the local funds that are collected locally, and then 2, the funds that come from the Community Preservation Trust Fund from the state. And then the community from these funds is required under statute to set aside at least 10% for affordable housing, 10% for historic preservation, and then 10% for open space or recreation. The remaining 70% can be allocated how the community wants. So the CPA statute does not require more than 10% for those 3 categories. And it also doesn't require that the funds be expended in a certain period of time. It's the community's choice. Some communities put a lot of funds into perhaps historic preservation one year and then maybe more in open space the next year, and that's a local choice. CPCs then create an application process, and many have a 2-step process where they might have a letter of intent, a shorter kind of summary of a proposal that then is reviewed and determined whether it's eligible for CPA resources before the applicant is invited to submit a full application. The recommendations do not end with the CPC. The CPC's job is to review applications and decide on recommendations for funding to the legislative body. So the CPC can decide which proposals to fund and at what level of funding. But these recommendations are made ultimately to the legislative body. So in a town, that would be the town meeting, and in a city, that would be city council. And then it's ultimately the legislative body's choice of whether they're going to accept the recommendations and fund them. And then the CPC is required to be filing a report with the Department of Revenue annually. It's due on September 15th. It's the CP3 report. And this report just outlines the way that the community is allocating CPA funds across all the different categories. And I'll get into it later, but some CPCs transfer money to the trust, to the Affordable Housing Trust, and the trust needs to be reporting back to the CPC so that those allocations can be added to the CP3 report annually as well. Under the CPA statute, there are sometimes what we just refer to as verbs. These verbs: acquire, create, preserve, support, rehabilitate. You see that on the left column. And then you have the different categories across the top of open space, historic, recreation, and housing. And all of these verbs apply to housing, community housing. They're all allowable, with the caveat that for rehabilitate, that it explicitly says in the CPA statute that CPA funds can only be used to rehabilitate community housing, affordable housing, if the housing was acquired or created with CPA funds. So it does create some restrictions of using CPA funds for existing housing that was not created or acquired with CPA funds. And then the statute gets into defining most of these terms. Create is technically not defined. So acquire is obtaining by gift, purchase, device, grant. Acquire speaks to purchasing a real property interest. And in the CPA statute, a real property interest includes restrictions, affordability restrictions. Preserve is really a higher bar than some communities treat it. It's to protect real property from injury, harm, or destruction. So it's not just a way to rehabilitate existing housing. It really is a higher bar. It oftentimes with housing speaks to affordability restrictions that are expiring, so the unit is going to be lost. Sometimes it is applied to units that are at risk of being lost because of something like excessive roof leaking, where the unit is no longer going to be inhabitable. But it's a high bar. It's not at all rehab. Support is the verb that's only used for housing. And if some of it is acknowledging that there are particular challenges with creating affordable housing. And so some uses that have fallen under this in the past have been that some communities have a housing coordinator that's specifically working on CPA eligible activities, and they may fund that position partly under the support category, or doing some housing planning, updating a housing production plan perhaps. And then there was some language added to help define support, to specify that this can include providing grants or loans, rent assistance, or other forms of assistance, specifically for the purpose of making housing affordable. So during the pandemic, there were CPA funds that were used for emergency rent assistance programs, and it was under the support category. And again, rehab is only allowed if the units were acquired or created with CPA. Just a couple of things, because these are public resources and we're talking about affordable housing. And sometimes you'll hear people talk about lowercase a affordable, uppercase a affordable, but to really be affordable housing, there is a restriction tied to it. And CPA does talk about this, that under section 12, that when a real property interest is acquired with CPA funds, it shall be bound by a permanent restriction. So that word shall is that it's not a choice. It's not if you want, it's not when you want, it's that it shall, when a real property interest is acquired, then it shall be bound by the permanent restriction for the purpose in which it was bought. So if it's for housing, then there needs to be a housing affordability restriction on those units or the land. It does allow for nonprofit to enforce the restriction as well as manage the property. And then just two tips is that the CPA statute does allow CPA funds to be transferred to the trust. It's explicitly said it's allowed in the statute. But even though they're both municipal boards, the CPC should still have a grant agreement with the trust. You still should have clear parameters of why you're transferring the funds. If it's just more general for CPA eligible activities, that's fine, but it should be in the grant agreement. There should be language around a timeline of when you expect the funds to be used. So affordable housing can take a long time. You don't want to be too punitive, but if funds haven't been allocated in maybe 5 years or 6 years, the CPC might want to have language expecting those funds to be returned. You also should have language around your expectation that the trust report back on an annual basis of how they're expending the resources. We do have a fillable form that we've created to make this easier for trusts, and Stuart from the Community Preservation Coalition, the statewide CPC, helped to create these forms. So those are forms that the CPC could distribute to the trust at the time of putting together the grant agreement and signing the grant agreement. I would suggest that the CPC be explicit in the grant agreement of the date that you want the report each year from the trust, so that there's no ambiguity in that. And then one other point is that the CPA area median income numbers may differ from HUD numbers. And pretty much every affordable housing development, particularly everyone that receives state or federal funds, uses HUD numbers, and they might not completely match CPA area median numbers. So the CPC just wants to be aware of that and be paying attention to that, particularly as you're allocating funds to the trust, to make sure that there's an understanding about that for the trust as well. So I wanted to pause and just see, Emma, if there are CPA specific questions that might be helpful to address now.
Yes, there are a few that have come up. So the first one is, does the fee at the Registry of Deeds apply when buying property in a community that has not passed CPA?
Yes, so there are certain fees that exist for all transactions, regardless of whether a community is part of CPA, which was actually part of the campaign in Boston trying to get CPA passed, is that so many funds were being added to the registry and then redistributed in other communities that Boston wasn't receiving those. So it's any community. It's just that it's the type of the fee that is certain fees exist, and it's for every transaction across the state, any community, every community.
Great. Does acquire include tax taking?
That's a great question. I'm not quite sure if the community is paying for the tax taking. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'll make a note of that and we'll see if we can get that answered.
Okay. Another similar one is, can support include a linkage study that will enable the city to generate additional revenue for affordable housing?
Yeah, so we've had multiple communities ask about this, and we feel strongly that that's not allowed. That that CPA is about making housing affordable. It's about actively creating and preserving affordable housing, and the idea of it's not about figuring out how to fund housing outside of that. So we don't see that as an allowable use of CPA funds.
Where can the form be obtained for the CPC grant agreements? That is in the housing toolbox. I was about to hit send on that, and then Shelly, so I will put that.
So if it's grant agreements,
grant.
I don't know if they're asking for a model of a grant agreement. I don't think we have that on the housing toolbox. A great resource for all things CPA is actually to start with the Community Preservation Coalition's website, which I think is communitypreservation.org. And I believe that they have an example of a grant agreement. They might have a few. So I would start with that. If you're interested in the CP3 reporting, the document, the fillable form that we've created, that is on the housing toolbox. And we can also add it to where we're going to be posting this this recording, as well as the slides. We can add those documents just so it's all in one place for folks.
Great. What other source than HUD would set the CPA AMI?
So would set the CPA AMI. So the Department of Revenue sets the CPA AMI, and they just don't use the same formula as HUD. HUD takes into account household size, and the Department of Revenue hasn't. So I think that the Department of Revenue uses HUD's 100% AMI, but then I think their 80% is just a straight 80% and not taking into account household size. So that's where the difference happens. So the 80% may not match up. So you just want to pay attention to that. And I think when you do a grant agreement, that you want to be explicit about about AMI and what that means and how it might differ with CPA.
Great. And Stuart just put the link for those grant agreements in the chat. So if anyone missed that, it's in the chat.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stuart.
Two more questions have come in, Shelly. What does permanently affordable mean? Can this be an affordability restriction that is renewable?
So I'm not an attorney, and I'm not going to get in too specific in this. The statute does say permanent, but I know that there are some questions about whether that what exactly that means and the legality behind that. So I'm gonna actually say that you would need to talk with your counsel about that, but that unlike some programs where it only requires 20 or 30-year affordability, the CPA statute does say permanent. So it might be set up in a way that's renewable, but you would have to speak with counsel.
Great. And then the last one that has come in is, does the Affordable Housing Trust need to have the town administrator be a signatory for contracts utilizing CPA funding?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Sure.
Need to have the town administrator.
Does the Affordable Housing Trust need to have the town administrator be a signatory for contracts utilizing CPA funding?
Okay. So I actually can't answer that for sure. And I don't know if some of that is going to reflect how your community implements these statutes, if it's going to be similar with other boards, how you do this. So I'm not really sure offhand.
Great.
So, okay, so to switch gears, so affordable housing trust funds, we now in this state have about 147 local affordable housing trust funds. Most of these are organized under the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust Fund statute that was passed in 2005, although about 10 or 12 were established before 2005. It's approximately, because unlike the Community Preservation Act, where communities that accept CPA expect to get state funding through the trust fund, so there's a guaranteed, there's a huge incentive to be reporting that they've accepted CPA. It's a more extensive process because it has to go before voters. There's the Community Preservation Coalition, which has a member-based model. So there's just better communication on that and incentive to report. That doesn't exist for affordable housing trust funds. So we do our best to keep up on it and think we have most of them across the state. So it means that we're at about 42% of communities in Massachusetts have a local housing trust fund. This CPA is well over 50% of communities, but it's in terms of trust funds, we've seen extraordinary interest, particularly in the last 5 years, really triggered by the pandemic. I've just seen a rapid increase. I think that in the last 5 years, the numbers have increased by, I think, a third of these communities have been established just in the last 5 years. It's been extraordinary. So similar to CPA, because this is it's a state statute, it's an enabling statute. If you want to read it, it's actually a very short statute under Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 55C. And as far as statutes go, in my opinion, it's relatively easy to read and understand as just a layperson. It is a public entity, a municipal entity, similar to CPA. It's created by the local legislative body, just a majority vote. So unlike CPA, where it has to go before the full voting population, this is just the legislative body. So in a town, it's town meeting. In the city, it'd be the city council. The focus of the trust is really pretty narrow. It's to create and preserve affordable housing for low and moderate income households. I know that sometimes communities want to create a trust thinking that it will be all things housing, but the statute really wasn't created to be all things housing. It really was more kind of along the lines of CPA, where it's creating and preserving affordable housing. It's really about more housing, affordable housing. It's led by a board of trustees that's appointed locally. And similar, because it's a municipal board, it's subject to public procurement, designer selection, conflict of interest, and public meeting laws, just like all of our other municipal boards. So the trust statute specifically says under purpose is to provide for the creation and preservation of affordable housing in municipalities for the benefit of low and moderate income households and for the funding of community housing as defined in accordance with CPA. So several years ago, this language tying the trust to the CPA statute was added, partly because, well, a lot of it was because many CPCs were transferring funds to the trust, and we wanted to make sure that it was clear that all of the restrictions and requirements of CPA follow the funds to the trust. And also that it allows particularly activities under support to be utilized for a trust. So before, when it was just create and preserve, it didn't clearly state support. So there were concerns in communities that maybe that wasn't allowed, even though they had CPA funds. So now everything that's allowed under community housing with CPA is allowable for a trust to engage in as well. So it is a more narrow scope, and it's about low and moderate income only. It's not about mixed income. It's not about market rate as well. It really is a focus on low and moderate income. Very broadly, trusts can address affordable housing needs, support local control of housing initiatives. The trust can explicitly engage in real estate activity. They can buy and sell real estate. And unlike the CPC, which makes recommendations to the legislative body, the trust doesn't have to go to the legislative body. The trust can make funding allocations itself, so it can move more nimbly. And so where CPCs likely operate with a deadline, an application process that has a deadline, and they're trying to line up with, in many cases for towns, with town meeting. For a trust, if they have funds available, they may be more able to take applications on a rolling basis, or if they have the funds to respond to, say, a property that comes on the market, so to be able to act a little bit more nimbly. And then as a municipal board, they can collect funds from a variety of sources, and we're seeing communities get more and more creative and intentional about how they're raising funds for their trust. So while about 76% of trusts are in communities that also have the CPC, the Community Preservation Act, we're seeing more and more communities find other funding sources and not just rely on CPA. And even when you have CPA, it's not a guarantee that that will be a funding source for the trust. The trust statute is very short and not extremely prescriptive, but it does have some basic parameters around trustees. It requires a minimum of 5. This includes the chief executive officer. So in a town with with a select board, that would be 1 member of the select board and a mayor in a city. These trustees are appointed by either the mayor in some forms, city forms, the city council is involved in this. In a town, the select board would make the appointments. The statute requires a minimum of 2-year terms, and then identifies trustees as public agents. So similar to other boards, they're considered public agent and a special municipal employee. The statute outlines 16 explicit powers that a community can accept and give to the trustees. It also allows for communities to expand on the powers in line with the statute, and communities can modify powers as well, and some do. Are you seeing questions come in about trusts, Emma?
Yes, there are quite a few. How do we go about establishing an affordable housing trust coalition so we're getting support and training like community preservation committees have?
So There isn't a statewide entity that is comparable to the Community Preservation Coalition in Massachusetts. So unfortunately, trusts don't have the same kind of organized support. MHP provides some, but it's nowhere near the model of the Community Preservation Coalition. And part of that is because trusts aren't automatically funded, and many of our trusts don't have any funding. And so there isn't a funding mechanism to create a similar kind of structure. You can always reach out to me and my colleagues at MHP, and we can help start you down the road to support you in this, and we can help connect you with other trusts. You might find a partner and support in your regional planning agency. So we have regional planning agencies all across the state, and they're in differing levels of how much they're engaged with trusts, but many of them do support trusts. So there are resources available, and you can always start with just reaching out to me, and I'm happy to help start you down that road.
Great. Does an affordable housing trust allow for residential facilities for the disabled that require community support?
So trust resources can fund housing, that supportive housing, yes.
Are there any implications for an affordable housing trust to work with entities like Habitat for Humanity?
Yes, many trusts as well as CPCs fund Habitat for Humanity housing development.
Are low and moderate income as defined by are low and moderate income defined by CPC standards or HUD AMI? You noted that they might be different.
So is the definition of low and moderate income in the trust statute? Based on CPA?
Yes, and is it the CPC or is it HUD standards?
So in the trust statute, there is not a definition section like in the CPA statute, and low and moderate income is not explicitly defined. And there are some different opinions. Like some may think that because the language ties CPA to the trust and the purpose of the trust to CPA uses, some may think that that limits the trust to 100% of the area median income, similar to the CPA statute. Others might think that there's more flexibility. So we have historically encouraged communities to be looking at existing definitions of low and moderate income and to intentionally define that for your community. So with HUD or the subsidized housing inventory in Massachusetts, you would have an 80% ceiling for affordable housing. Community CPA goes to 100% of the area median income. The state's Affordable Housing Trust Fund defines moderate income up to 110% of the area median income. We don't know of any other definitions of moderate income that goes actually higher than 110, maybe 120% AMI. So you would need to look at the statute for yourself. I think bring in counsel, your municipal council, to think about what is allowed under the trust statute, and then define that for yourself and be really explicit about that. So there's no guessing.
Great. Is land owned by the trust subject to procurement laws like 30B? Is there a difference between town-owned land and land owned by the Affordable Housing Trust?
The trust does need to follow procurement. The exception is if you're using all of CPA funds to purchase land, then there's some allowance around not being bound by 30B if you're using all CPA funds. If it's just some CPA funds and other funds, then that triggers procurement. So the trust absolutely does need to follow procurement.
And then what are some of the creative sources communities are using to fund their trust?
So CPA is clearly one. We have some that have inclusionary zoning and they allow for in lieu of payment. And there are some bylaws or ordinances that explicitly say that in lieu payments are directed to the trust. We even have a trust where they get to set what those payments are, the level of payments. We have communities that use free cash, so municipal funds are sometimes transferred to the trust, like Brookline has done that, Truro has done that. We have one community that has, Medfield has allowed up to $1 million to be bonded against the municipal budget to support trust efforts. Orleans has passed an override that they see as a permanent override to fund their trust. And because of that, it's a $275,000 override. Because of that, they are the only trust that I know of that have a line of credit with a bank because they have this funding source, this reliable funding source. We have some communities that are receiving or trying to receive short-term rental fees, or at least a percentage of the local fees from short-term rentals. We have some communities that take donations or fundraising. Wellfleet does an event in the summer to try to build off of the influx of residents in the summer to raise some funds. There may be other special ordinances that help raise funds. Somerville has a ordinance that helps to raise some funds for their trust. There's payments from a cell phone tower on the Cape that's not very much money. It's small, but it is guaranteed money for the trust each year. So there are a variety of different ways. Of course, ARPA funds, many trusts benefited from trusts benefited from some ARPA funds. So there are a variety of different ways that communities are trying to raise funds, not just CPA, although CPA definitely is a very important resource in many communities.
And relatedly, are there other examples of how trusts have used their funding in support of housing?
Yep, so we have a lot of different ways, and I'm not actually going to take the time to get into that right now, but we have actually many different trainings on the housing toolbox, and it does get into some of that. I'm also happy to do some follow-up offline if that person wants to reach out to me directly. Are there any other kind of technical things about trusts? Yeah, so Brookline posted they get free cash. So that is one of the communities that I've seen receives free cash from the town. The trust receives free cash.
How many affordable housing trusts exist in towns that do not have CPA passed? How viable is that? Are there other creative ways towns are adding funds to their trusts? We kind of answered that last part.
Yeah, so there definitely are communities that have a trust but not CPA, and some of them do have other funding sources, and then some, like, so Medfield is the community where they don't have CPA. But they did, when they established their trust, they also through the ballot they agreed to allow up to $1 million to be bonded by the trust fund. I don't know at this point if they have used any of that, if they've bonded anything. The last I heard, which was 2 or 3 years ago, they hadn't. But it doesn't mean that the trust isn't actively engaged in the community. They have found other ways where they actively support the permitting process of developments that include affordable housing that they think are good developments for the community. So there are ways, particularly in communities that are seeing housing development, for the trust to be actively engaged in helping to support the creation of affordable housing without actually spending anything. So I think for communities that don't have funding, in some cases, they do struggle to be effective. In other communities, I think that they've found other ways to be really relevant and to help move the needle without necessarily using money.
Right. And there are just 3 that I think are pretty quick. When an affordable housing trust acquires a property for housing, does the name of the trust become the name of the owner on the deed?
I believe so.
Okay. Is mixed-use housing ever acceptable in order to help pay for the cost of building or repurposing existing housing?
Yes. What you need to be careful with is that if you're wanting to use CPA funds or even trust funds to buy land for mixed use development, that's where it becomes tricky, particularly with CPA, because CPA says when you acquire a real property interest, there must be a restriction in perpetuity for the purpose in which you bought it. So if you're buying land and you're intending it to be mixed use, it's impossible to put the appropriate restriction for CPA if you're planning on having market rate housing there. So it's difficult with land acquisition. It's much more easy to invest in development costs where you can make it proportional. So if half of the units are affordable and half are market rate, then you just make sure that what you're contributing isn't more than half of the costs. So land makes it really difficult, but development when you want to invest in mixed use development, that is much more easy to satisfy or to make sure that you're in line with, particularly the CPA statute, but the trust statute as well.
And then last quick one, are donations to a housing trust tax deductible?
So I've been told by an attorney that works in municipal law that they would be, because it's a municipal entity. So that means that communities could potentially seek, trust could potentially receive land donation or, building donation potentially, and that the person could receive a tax deduction for that, tax write-off.
Great. Awesome.
Great.
That's all for now, Shelly. Thanks.
Thanks. So just switching into some tips for working together. It's not rocket science. Hopefully you'll get something from this. Hopefully it'll be a little bit helpful. But one thing is that at MHP, we always encourage communities to have pretty current, like within 5 years, the data of housing needs in your community. So not that data solves everything or convinces everyone, but we really encourage communities to start with the data so that you have a good broad picture of the housing needs across the community, and then to build your policy from that, to build your goals and your strategies out of that. Oftentimes, a housing trust may be actively engaged in this and supporting this work, perhaps even funding the plan or the housing needs analysis, housing production plan. You want to make sure that the CPC is engaged as well or invited to be involved, that there's reporting back to the CPC about what you're finding in your housing needs. You don't want to gather this data and create a housing plan in a vacuum. You want to make sure that key boards, city council, select board, perhaps planning board, ZBA, definitely the CPC are involved. And it might not be that they're showing up at everything, but I think presenting data back, not expecting them, every board member to read a 100+ page plan, but pulling out the executive summary. I think it's smart practice for the trust to be really articulate about kind of the key findings in your plan so that you can be repeating those when you go to different boards, to be presenting that to the CPC so that you're kind of establishing some of the legitimacy of the needs in the community and why you've created the goals and the strategies that you've created, that they're tied to this data that you've gathered about the community. And also so that you're not just reacting to what might be the path of least resistance in what you're presenting, but that you're really responding to identified needs in the community. So make sure that the CPC and the other key boards are aware of the identified housing needs. I think that it's important for trusts and CPCs to be in communication and to really understand how the boards are going to work, because your work is overlapping. So while the CPC, it has 4 different categories that they're looking at funding, the trust has just one, but it's a similar category. And what does that mean for the community? Are you going to keep operating where both boards will fund affordable housing? Is the CPC going to expect that the trust be the primary housing funder in the community? What do you need from each other? How often do you need reporting or communication? If CPA funds are being transferred to the trust, is the CPC okay with those funds being used for some administrative costs of the trust? I've been in multiple communities where that didn't seem to be understood or talked about. And then there were issues when the trust started trying to use it for like a housing coordinator kind of position, and the CPC didn't anticipate that. So have these kind of conversations early, have them often, and don't just be in touch when the trust wants more money. I think open up a line so that you're periodically having conversations and clearing the air and making sure that the people are on the kind of the same page. CPCs can fund trusts, and it looks different in different communities. In some, the CPC wants the trust to apply for specific programs or activities. In some communities, they're okay with the trust just asking for a chunk of money, $300,000, 200, whatever it might be, for CPA eligible activities, but not overly specific, so that the trust has a little bit more flexibility. And then in some communities like Cambridge and Somerville, they transfer a big chunk of their CPA funds each year to their trust. In Cambridge, they transfer 80% of their funds to their trust, and they really see the trust as the community housing arm of the CPC. Somerville transfers about 45% to their trust, but developers can also go to the CPC in Somerville. Some communities may transfer about 10%, but in a lot of communities, it differs year to year. So I think having some conversation about how you see this relationship, the funding relationship between the CPC and the trust, is important to do, just to be open and explicit about that. And again, I've already talked about grant agreements. I'm going to talk about them again. We, even between CPCs and trusts, you should have a grant agreement. The CPC should outline what the amount of funds, what the funds are for, a way to receive the funds back, or when the funds should be returned back, under what circumstances. Again, reminding the trust about your expectation that they report back how they're allocating funds on an annual basis, giving them a deadline of when you want that report, and make it clear that that is it's their statutory requirement. You are expecting it and you're going to be asking for it. This is a screenshot of the form. It's a fillable Word document, and it's using the exact language of the CP3 form. So this is for the trust to fill out, to give to the CPC, and then it's made really easy for them to implement it into the Department of Revenue CP3 form, because it's using the exact language. We also have an instructions document, because while it seems like it should be easy, some of the way that the language, the questions that are asked, it might be a little bit tricky. So we have directions as well of how to fill out this form. And these documents are both on the Housing Toolbox. And again, I said we will connect these to where these slides and this video is added to the Housing Toolbox as well, so that it can be easy for you to find. I think that the CPC just giving links to these right away with the grant agreement, and then again before the deadline, is probably a smart move. Number 6, we encourage communities all the time to be transparent, ensure transparency. Between these two boards, between your trust and your CPC, be transparent, as well as outward facing to the community. I feel like too many times the CPC may not be aware, just may not know how much CPA money is still in the trust account, and there just isn't sometimes good communication, and that just creates issues in the community. Be transparent. Sometimes trusts will consider a joint board appointment, so sometimes there might be a CPC member on the trust board. It can be a little bit tricky because at least 5 of the positions on the CPC board are representatives of other boards, and so you're just adding a lot of boards. And the trust board really needs to be an active working board, so you need to be thoughtful about that, but it can help with communication. Report back if this is an annual or twice a year kind of reporting back, but intentionally, thoughtfully be reporting back to the CPC, to other boards in the community. When you do allocate funds, both the CPC and the trust promote that, make it easy for people to know what you're investing in. For a CPC, yes, it's in the warrant if you're a town, but I don't think you should expect people to have to dig through a warrant or a summary of a warrant for them to know where their CPC money is going if they miss town meeting. Make it, use a web page, use social media, whatever your town uses, but use different ways to communicate that so that people don't have to search high and low to figure out where their CPA and their trust resources are going. And unfortunately, I feel like I see more of a animosity or competition between trusts and CPCs, much more than I would like to. And I would just encourage you to try to center your efforts of both boards on more housing, just the goal of creating more affordable housing. Start there, and then figure out how can you complement each other's work, how can you work together to increase the supply of housing locally, but really start by centering on this goal, and less on individual personalities or slights or perceived slights, but really keep your focus on increasing access to affordable housing in your community. Perhaps easier said than done, but I think still important. And something that the boards can do together is to help to create a culture of support in the community for affordable housing. And this document, you don't have to live here. It is now a little bit dated, but it's one that I still really love, and I still think about it a lot. And you can just Google that and it'll come up. But it's a partnership. Some of you may know Dr. T, who's done a lot of engagement work in Massachusetts with CHAPA. But it's testing different messages about affordable housing and why some of them succeed and why some of them fail. And they bring up different things like balancing people with places and systems. So not just talking about people that need affordable housing, but what are the things in our communities that make it difficult for people to access housing they can afford? Tell the story of us, not them, because all of our communities have people that are struggling with their housing costs that could benefit from more affordable housing. Connecting housing to other social issues and outcomes. We know that health outcomes improve and educational outcomes improve when people have safe, affordable housing, that they're not stressed and worried about their housing. We know through data that where you live affects your outcomes and your opportunities. And so talk about that. And to consider the language that you use when you're talking about affordable housing. And I think that it can be beneficial for trustees, but also others involved in housing to really think about the needs in the community and how you're going to talk about affordable housing in the language that you're going to use. So in this particular report, they tested home versus housing, and people thought of housing as public housing. And we know that public housing is absolutely critical and a vital part of our housing infrastructure, but it can have negative connotations for some people. And whereas home is oftentimes where people find themselves and it's their family, it's more personal. And so even language, choosing to talk about affordable homes, even though we tend to say housing so often, or like in the development world, we talk about projects, housing projects, and that can it can trigger a lot of people. And so I try to use the word development, housing development. So be thoughtful about how you talk about this, how you frame it in your community to hopefully be as effective as possible in your work. And then lastly, one thing that you can both do is both boards can actively be investing in funding affordable housing development. So I have just two examples that I'm going to highlight. One is this development in Norwell, which had been a police station that was declared surplus. It was actually transferred to the trust, which isn't all that common, but it does happen sometimes. And then the trust really oversaw the process of doing some pre-development work, releasing a request for proposals, and then a nonprofit responded and built 18 units of senior age-restricted rental housing. And that between the trust and the CPC, over about $1.2 million were invested in to make this development happen. So they both partnered on that. And then this is another example in Beverly with another nonprofit developer, Harborlight. They presented this proposal for 77 units of rental housing built in two different phases. And they worked with the city to designate it as a 40R district, which is a zoning a zoning program run by the state under HLC, and it requires greater density and a percentage that's affordable, but it also gives funding incentive to the community. And then this nonprofit benefited from that to be able to permit under 40R. And the CPC and the trust both contributed resources toward this so that the developer could then go to the state for state and federal resources to create these 77 units of housing in Beverly. So in some communities like Cambridge, they pretty much see the trust as doing the funding, but in many communities, it's open where a developer can come to both entities. And that's certainly potentially beneficial for the developer, although it's up to the community of how you structure that. So just a few final things to kind of reiterate is I really encourage communities to be intentionally working on building a trust relationship between your CPC and your trust. Don't assume that it will happen or that it should happen. We're all human, and we all have different perspectives on things and personalities. And I think that this needs to be a relationship that is nurtured and that's built over time, and that is not just when the trust wants money, but that's a year-round conversation between the boards. Two, we really encourage you to develop goals and strategies that reflect identified needs that you have found in the community, and then to be sure that you're communicating this and that you're reporting on your progress. This is particularly, I think, important for the trust to be explicit about this and to be communicating this across different boards, including with the CPC. Again, not just when you're asking for money, but to have this be an open conversation that they're familiar with your work throughout the year. And three, which I've been saying, is just to maintain open communication between your boards. Not just when you need something, but to really, really invest in those relationships and that communication over time. MHP has a ton of different resources, online resources, and we also are here for you at any time. This is Emma and my contact information, and you're free at any time to reach out to us. And if we can't answer something, we'll do our very best to connect you with someone who can. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just ask Emma to bring up some questions that we can answer some questions in the remaining time here.
Great. So the last one I see is, how can a housing authority and an affordable housing trust cooperate together? Wellfleet is coming to mind.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I got distracted by one of the comments in the chat. I'm so sorry. What was that again?
No, that's okay. How can a housing authority and an affordable housing trust cooperate together?
Mm-hmm. So there are housing authorities that apply to trust for funding, because we do have some housing authorities that are continuing to invest in building affordable housing. So that's an option, that we do have trust funding new development of housing authorities. We have some housing authorities that don't actually have units. So Emma brought up Wellfleet, which is small, and they don't actually have units, but their housing authority has run different programs. So they've done rent assistance and down payment assistance. So they have worked with the CPC and the trust collaboratively on identifying needs and building funding that's available for affordable housing, including programs. So it can look different in different communities. I think that housing authorities and trusts working together on messaging and identifying the needs in the community and articulating that, I think that is a great way just to help to build the culture of support for affordable housing locally. And I oftentimes encourage trusts, especially with new trusts, to be in communication with different entities like the housing, including the housing authority, to make sure that you're really clear on each other's roles so that you're not stepping on toes or duplicating. So I think there are a lot of ways that those entities can collaborate.
Great. And similarly, how can staff foster communication between boards, and what have other communities done for this?
Mm-hmm. One thing that I see with trusts is that while most of the trustees tend to be residents in the community who are not staff, they're not municipal staff, we do have some that have appointed municipal staff. And I frankly think that it's probably a good idea to have at least one municipal staff person, particularly if it's a strategic position. So in Brewster, they actually have a seat for their town administrator, who has appointed the assistant town administrator to sit on the trust board. So it's someone who knows pretty much everyone, like all the leaders, they know the different board members. And so I think it helps facilitate communication between boards. If everyone is a volunteer that has a full-time job that's completely different, then it can be more difficult, I think, to kind of close the loop on communication. But having a staff person, I think, can be really strategic thing for a community to do. Beverly's the only community that I know that they have 5 trustees on their trust, and 3 of them are actually municipal employees. So majority. That's really unique, but I think that considering having, particularly on your trust, at least one municipal employee can do a lot to help with communication. And CPCs, I should say, because 5% of CPA funds can go towards administering CPA, that there are, I think probably many, if not most, CPCs have at least a part-time staff person that helps to support the CPC that might also help with some communication between boards.
Great. That's all the questions I have seen, but if I missed any or anyone has any, feel free to chime in.
Another thing I will say is not just communication with boards, but also if you have a local group of housing activists, housing groups outside of the municipality, but that are actively engaged and interested in affordable housing, I think including them, reaching out to them, making sure that you're communicating with them, particularly if you're trying to get support for your goals, your strategies for what you're investing in. I think that that's also really smart to build those relationships. So one, I'm getting a private message saying that Somerville has actually been transferring more like 50% of their CPA funds to their trust in recent years, which is fantastic. And then I see Keith's question about whether MHP can organize a statewide conference, in-person conference for trusts. And we will put that in our list for things to think about. We used to do in-person stuff before the pandemic, and we just haven't more recently. So we'll put that on our list of what we should be considering in the future. Thanks, Keith.
Do you want to talk about the intensive TA, Shelly?
Just a reminder, if you haven't seen it, that we are looking to bring on 2 to 3 new communities to work with in 2025 that either already have an affordable housing trust fund and you need a little bit of work with things like identifying goals and strategies or some specific program, or a community that's interested in creating an affordable housing trust fund. So we'd like to, so we have a deadline of December 13th for applications. It's a really pretty simple application. And Emma I think she just connected, maybe she will put in the connections for that. But we'll be announcing a few communities in January to spend about 10 to 12 months working with communities just to give more intensive monthly support to either an existing trust or if you're wanting to establish a trust in 2025. So applications are due on the 13th, and we'll be announcing communities in early January. And if there are no other questions, again, this is recorded. We'll be posting this to the Housing Toolbox. The slides will be added. We'll add the fillable forms for trust to be reporting back to CPCs. You have our information. Reach out at any time. MHP wants to support your work, and we thank you so much for taking the time out. And we hope that you'll join us next week to learn more specifically from Amherst and Marshfield how their trusts have developed goals and strategies and their process around that, their thinking this past year. So we hope you'll join us next week, next Wednesday at noon. Thanks so much.